Greetings all. Welcome back to the Powerhouse Perspective, empowering leaders for business breakthroughs. If you haven't joined us before, I'm Scott Medeiros, president of Helm, and this is Chandler Rhodes, the CEO of the Rosewood family of companies. This is podcast number 4. If you haven't listened to the first 3 pieces, please go forth and do so. What we've been talking about is using a sea metaphor in order to describe business. We talk about the leader of a business being a captain and the business itself being a ship. And what we talked about at the end of the last session, episode number 3, was the fact that a person or a captain takes over a ship. And what are the things that the captain does in order to get themselves acquainted with this new business or this new vessel? And today we're going to take it into more of a personal blend and try to talk about the captain themselves and a little bit of what they need to do to become self-aware. So Chandler, let's take it from there. I know you and I have discussions all the time about self-reflection, self-awareness. So as we now talk about a captain who has now found themselves at the head of a new business, what about the captain themselves should they consider?
Yeah, it's one that's been played out quite a bit, and you can find many podcasts on how to really discover thyself. So it's an old phrase, obviously, all the way back from the Greeks, and if you go back to the Old Testament, it's 1,000 or 2,000 years prior to that. So we had a little debate in the previous podcast on my inclination to do a self-evaluation when you find yourself in charge.
Right.
And so Scott, being the aviator and trainer and much more adept at what do you do when you're actually in charge of a aircraft, in his instance, I think wisely spoke to first evaluate what you have control of and then decide who you're going to be and what you need to be to run it going forward. So know thyself, orient yourself. Who are you as a person really is key to be an authentic leader. You can't be an authentic leader if you don't truly understand your values and your purpose in life. Then take that and see how it aligns or tethers itself to the purpose of the business or the ship, if we're using that metaphor to move forward. So what are your values, Scott? How do you, there's a lot of info on that, but
yes, definitely. The values piece, and I think that's something that is so ingrained in us at the Rosewood family of companies that we take it for granted, is because we are a values-based company. And I think as a leader, as a captain of a new business or a new ship, that values piece is so important. But it begins not with the values of the organization, but the personal values, right? What am I all about? What are those things that I will not compromise on? Because if the business that we're now ahead of is misaligned with that, it's going to cause friction. So I think as a captain, that self-awareness, that ability to say, what are my core values? What are the things that absolutely must be in place? And then more importantly, what are some of the aspirational values that I have? And then you also going to play into what are some of the pay for play values. In order to do business, you're going to have certain values of ethics and morals and those sort of things. But having those things in alignment and spending time to figure out who you are first before anything else, I think is probably the most important part.
So I phrase, discovering your values is kind of available in the market. So there are some great books. Lencioni does a great job. I think you were running down his list of how he organizes values. But one of the ways that you and I have actually had some debates in the past is you can go through that values discovery in a way that is what's important to you, what is core to you. We flipped it on its head when I've worked with several people and said, what causes you righteous anger?
Yes, righteous indignation. Indignation, yes.
So the reason I like to do that is you can become unaware of the fact that you are kind of voicing values that you personally aspire to as if they're really yours. And so that is being a fraud. There's a lot of talk on, being, unauthentic, adapting somebody else's values or values you think that sound good to other people. And so one of the ways we guard against that, and that is half of the equation certainly, is to write out what you value, what you see as the best. The other half is to say, when you see this exhibited in someone else, really fires you up as unacceptable. Yeah. And so that exercise has allowed us to really narrow down when we went through groups of people. And We may have a group of 6 or 8 people. They might narrow down to their 10 to 15 values. We get together. We start really trying to hone down what is the core emotional set of values for this leader and for this leader's crew, is what really does fire you up. When someone fails to show respect, when someone refuses to show mercy in a situation, what is they refuse to do the right thing and take ownership? What is it that really gets you fired up and emotional? And that's a good way to me to kind of crystallize or distill down which values are the most meaningful to you. So we've done that exercise in this conversation. We'll fast forward ahead. Scott, I think one of the big mistakes is, I found myself, I discovered my values.
Mm-hmm.
We tether those to the company. What do we do with them when we actually put them in the business? So most, they're everywhere. Everybody puts them on the wall. There's a lot of books out,
Right.
Lots of companies. How do we operationalize? You being the operation
Yeah.
expert, what do we do with values to make sure that they're infused into the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you don't want them to just be on the wall. You don't want them to be written down. Perhaps they're in your employee handbook that you read once and you just assume people are going to operate that way. I found that, and we do that here at the Rosewood Family of Companies, is we actually verbalize our values quite a bit. And we also hold each other accountable that when we're making a decision, are we doing it in accordance with the values? We also find a way to try to decompose those values to what it means at people at various levels of the organization. We call that a values decomposition. Because what a value looks like to me as the chief execution officer is different than what it looks like as that field rep in the field. And it's important for us to kind of translate our values into what it means to them. Because if indeed they know what it means to them, and then we can standardize on what good looks like, now we've got a common language to operate against to show that we are meeting the value, that we're consistent in what we mean by that value. If we leave it open to interpretation, then people are going to have perceptions of what they think a word actually means. So we need to do that decomp to ensure that we have people see it at each individual level, so that collectively from the bottom to the top of the organization and from the top to the bottom, everyone is aligned on what these values are, what they mean, and what good looks like.
All right. So we know what we stand for. We have, considered taking the helm of this vessel, taking charge of the business. What is our purpose? And before that,
yes,
what is our personal purpose? And again, like the values, are those aligned?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think it gets into a little bit of a debate, right? Because what we talked about just a moment ago were values. And now we're talking about the why, the purpose. If you're Simon Sinek, start with why. Purpose, some people call it the mission or the vision. All of those things kind of come together, but really what it says is, what is the organization, the entity about? What is the larger thing, the thing that the North Star that we're going to chart towards? And some people would say that you've got to determine that first and then you do your values. But we believe you do your values first and then your North Star or your why. Because I think if you don't know who you are first and your values, that why starts to become a bit malleable and it's not as concrete as it needs to be. And I think that's where problems actually start. So the why, what the business is all about, I think is equally important. That needs to be decomposed down throughout the organization, right? What the why looks like for me as an organization is one thing, but what is my own personal why? How does that tie into the larger organizational why? And if I'm at a different level of the organization, what does that look like at a managerial level as well? So it's again more of a decomposition of the why at the various levels. We call that the vertical alignment of the why.
Well, that discussion, it is, the Simon Sinek's view is start with why. Lencioni thinks you go with the why and forward. So we do break from, I guess, a lot of the people. And we've had several discussions. And one of the ways that we've had this discussion is you and I met each other through business. We look at, how do we align on our values first?
Correct.
If we're looking at a new venture and we're going to set sail, so you're looking at your crew, the first thing you better do is decide whether you share your values. That's not the same as liking each other, but that is if we can't coexist with our values, then we decide where we're going. I do think that it is a mistake. It's confirmation bias. There's a lot of technical information of, if I say we got together in order to launch this vessel, this business to go this direction, and it looks like we may not make it unless we bend the rules a little bit, our values may slightly tilt. Just like you would see in research, you see it often in statistics of, well, we'll just decide to count this one, and that's not really an outlier, so we can leave that in the data set because it lends a little bit more towards what my thesis was. And so those are a couple of reasons of, when you think of who you met and your friends, you get around them, you evaluate whether, hey, what do we have in common? Do we really have things in common? Right? Well, do we want to go do something together? And so I think the natural tendency is really to evaluate values sharing, and then, oh, we're good. So now let's go find something to do as a team. And so we try to mimic that, and that along the confirmation bias are two reasons I think that they go the other direction. So
I think that makes sense, right? If you and I agree that we fundamentally are aligned on our values, then we can accomplish great things together. But if we don't do that, even though we may be here for the same overall reason, there actually is going to be a disconnection, at least when it comes to making difficult decisions, because we don't have that common ethos, that common value system that keeps us aligned.
Well, the decision part is a part that I think also doesn't get enough emphasis when you see a lot of discussions on values and why. And what I mean is, the decision is hopefully right, but in reality, we're trying to make our best guess at what will take us towards where we're trying to go. So that might be our BHAG, our big ultimate goal, or it may be the next Y, the next waypoint. So we need to, launch one more city or one more state, or we need to roll out this new service line. To me, that's when you make a decision of how do we want to go into a market, how do we want to price, what kind of employees, that needs to be washed through. What do we stand for in values, and then measure that off of our purpose as an entity, and that may determine whether that next waypoint or that BHAG is actually something we feel comfortable, putting ourselves forward. And so then you get into the Nietzsche and the Frankl discussions of, and I think that lends a little more to our discussion. If you have a good enough why, you can survive anyhow. Essentially. And so, that story of Frankl, I think, gets a little more emphasis, and we brought it up here at the office a little while back because he tested that theory during the Holocaust in a concentration camp. Can he actually survive this experience without breaking down who he was as a person? And so there's a great book out there, but his ultimate why of getting back to his family and that relationship and the things that he decided to hold on to drove his decisions through some of the worst times in human history, at least documented times in human history. So when you tether your why to the organization's why, you have the ability to do what we call orient. And so I think what's important is, that sounds simple. It is a little more important to think about, do you want to be a leader that's disoriented? And so if you give the inverse description of someone who is not oriented towards something, I think it gives a little more power to, Scott, I'd really like you to lead this organization, but you're a disoriented person. It doesn't sound like a good idea. And so I think the inverse a little bit gives you a better understanding of, you need to be clear about your personal self, your personal purpose, and does that align with the company? And then when we make decisions, even if those are the wrong decisions, we can quickly go back and say, all right, well, they were wrong, but we had these things in mind, and maybe they were out of alignment with our values and our why, but you have to have something to measure against.
Well, yeah, what a fundamental concept, and such a powerful concept. Because in the day-to-day business, we're making decisions all the time. Issues come up, problems come up, personnel issues and or issues with customers, and we're solving things. But how often are we running it back through the filter to ensure that it's aligned with our values and aligned with our why? It's so easy to get distracted by the now, The intensity, the urgency draws us into it. But the discipline of understanding that we've got a value system and we've got a why that serve as our grounding mechanisms, our North Star, and using them as a filter to say, whatever we do, whatever emotion that we're currently feeling, let's kind of wash it back through our values and our why to make sure that we're oriented towards making the right decision. If we don't do that, I think the urgency of the item or the matter is going to draw us in a particular direction, which could be counter to your values and your why. So the orientation piece, wow, very fundamental concept, but I don't think a lot of us really do that habitually enough in order to keep us from getting into a bad situation or misalignment.
Yeah. Well, we've checked that box. So we've discussed the values, we've discussed the why. Now the question is, all right, well, I think I can run this business, take this next position at this organization. What is the next phase of that organization? What's the next waypoint on that journey? Is a logical question. So where are we going from here? I'm taking over. What does my 1 year, 3 year, 5 year look like?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then once you write that out, try to do an honest, objective description of what type of leader. So I know myself, what type of leader do I need to go to the next phase of that business? And so that becomes, what we call an avatar or an example of that ideal leader to take us on that next journey, that next leg on a voyage. Compare that to the skill set you have and you brought to the table.
Yeah.
And doing that honestly and with humility, looking at what are my actual attributes? What am I good at? What will it take to get to the next step? What attributes are needed there? Do I have the experience, the knowledge, even the personality, even the temperament? We talk about, are you more of an EQ type leader or are you very much an IQ, logistical, left brain, right brain?
Right.
Different organizations at different points of its growth, startup, sometimes on a rebuild phase. You really switch between needing to really corral around EQ, morale, building people up. And then when you hit high growth and maturity, you really need to dial in a lot of logistics, a lot of detail, a lot of process, and a lot of scalability. So talk a little bit about the importance of a leader being willing to lay out the ideal leader versus their skill set and the discussions that have to be made. Are you willing to cross that chasm that may be there from here to there?
Yeah, I think the piece that really kicked off in my head when you were describing that is, again, another fundamental concept, but not very many leaders do it. And that is, we're about to go on this next phase of the business. So this is next goal that we're trying to achieve from a business perspective. And what we try to do is say, we're already here. So I'm going to try to adapt myself in order to move the organization forward. Instead of taking a little bit of reflection and saying, what is actually needed first? So you mentioned the ideal. And I think that's the most important part, right? To be successful, if we had to draw it out and we had our ability to pick anyone with the right skill sets or the necessary skill sets to take us successfully to this next port on our journey, what would that person look like? What qualities would that person need to have? And then with that ideal, then come with the objective assessment of yourself and say, okay, do I have all of those things? And if there is a gap, it isn't as if, okay, let's just get rid of the captain, let's walk him off the plank. But at least now you can either find individuals who can fill that gap. It now allows you to be more aware so that you can do self-development, perhaps to bridge the gap, the chasm as you just talked about. But so often we don't set the ideal. We don't say, what does it take to be successful to the best of our abilities, and then map us back to find out where the gaps are. And that way you can spend time working on the gaps, mitigating the gaps in order to generate success. Instead, we automatically just start morphing. And I think when you morph, it starts moving the misalignment. It starts getting you out of orientation because what you're doing automatically is adjusting to the situation instead of you adjusting to the direction that you have committed to going.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Well, it comes to humility. And so there is I think a large misunderstanding of what humility means.
Yeah.
Most people think humility means that you are soft, not willing to take the tough challenge and those types of things. And I remember having dinner with a friend, and she was taking a job at Starbucks in Seattle, and has done really well, still there, and runs their design throughout Asia and China, so does really well. And she asked, "What would you do when you go into this meeting? To start out, I've never been here." And I said, "Well, you have to have confidence and show humility. And she says, well, how can you do both of those? Like, those are not diametrically opposed, I explained to her. It takes a lot of confidence to admit your shortcomings and to take an objective view of yourself. And a lot of humility, once you see that, to Scott's point, you don't quit. You don't give up. You don't necessarily say, I'm going to become the person that needed. You have the humility to say, I need help. I need to surround myself with other folks that can build me up, drive me to the next level, and take me through this next phase of the journey. And so humility gets a negative rap out of certainly misunderstanding, and humility and self-reflection I view as probably top one or two, if not number one reason I see leaders fail, to be frank. They're certainly smart enough. They work hard enough. They have the experience to do it. They just refuse to look at themselves objectively, see where they're weak, mitigate those weaknesses, and then make it on to the next phase. They just continue to pound and pound harder, even though we need a different tactic in this phase of the business or their career.
Well, I think it's easier for a leader to become more humble when they start saying it's not all about me, right? So once they realize that they are a steward, a captain, owner of that particular ship, and that it's not about them, it's about getting the ship, the business, to its next waypoint, then you can be a bit more humble because you're willing to take a step down because you've placed the mission, the why, ahead of self. And maybe that's part of the self-reflection is this, and the humbleness is to say, it's not all about me, right? This isn't about me being pleased or easy or in charge or whatever the case may be. It's about putting the right person at the right place at the right time, and it will make the organization collectively successful. And a good captain, I think, also has to be a good follower. Jocko Willing talked about that in the dichotomy of leadership. You got to know when to lead and when to follow. And actually, John Maxwell talks about this in many of his books. Talks about a good leader has to be a good follower. If you've never been able to be a good follower, how do you know what leadership is? Right? And so I think that's part of it. And part of that becoming humble is saying, hey, I may have to follow, may have to ask for help at this particular time, even though I'm supposed to be the perceived leader or captain of the ship. That shows a lot of humility.
I think that goes into another topic. You know, obviously we've spoken about that why and the principle why. That business, that entity needs to go above you, and you need to orient towards what's best for the business. And then that'll allow you to be a little more self-reflective and more understanding. And so what we talk about when we present to our leaders and we talk with other leaders is, are you a good steward?
Right.
And what is stewardship versus, we often say, take ownership. We've said it here for years. And stewardship and ownership are certainly not the same. And so another reason the metaphor of being a captain is a great example is the obligations, if you look them up, of a captain who's in charge of a vessel, they are certainly last, similar to when you were in, training in the Marines and the pilot's in charge of the helicopter or whichever aircraft they're flying. So the aircraft itself, the mission, the people on board, all those things come before the captain. You've heard of going down with the ship. There was actually a captain went off of Italy that went to prison not long ago for the cruise ship they sank.
The one
that he ran aground
on the side there,
and then he took off. Well, that's a bigger obligation to be a steward. So another way to think of it is, if you own something, it's yours. You can take it out in the yard and smash it with a hammer or light it on fire or whatever you decide. You can destroy it. If you are a steward and I entrust you with something that's not yours, you don't have the right to destroy that item, take it in the yard, bust it up, and light it on fire. So it is a mindset that even if you are the owner, you need to adopt that mindset that I have been given something that I need to leave in a better place for the future. And then that drives my decisions of what's in it for the ownership and leadership, what's in it for the employees. That balance is much easier to achieve when both of you are trying to do what's best for the entity. If I'm trying to take advantage of the employees, maximize profits, pay them as little as possible, or vice versa, their opinion is all leadership wants to do is take all the money that I should be getting, then you're fighting left to right instead of looking upward towards what's best for the business. And so stewardship, putting that purpose up top, understanding that entity, the ship, hard to survive on an actual vessel. So we're back to the metaphor when it sinks. So you don't get very far, and that seems obvious as well, but we forget it so often. And it's, a lot of times it is leadership that starts that battle of, you do what I said. Well, again, take the time to decompose the purpose. Take the time to explain why this is important to the success of not only the company, but to the employee. Why is this an important decision? And if your leader can't do that, they really don't have much reason to complain about employees not backing them, not being bought in, not being fully committed to the direction that we're going. That's the leader's fault.
Well, so much of what we've talked about so far actually builds right back to this. So the concept of stewardship, which you just articulated very well, is important to us. But you have some who have difficulty becoming a good steward. And the reason is because they haven't actually spent time to identify their values and haven't identified the why. Because if so, then they would have placed something above themselves. And because they know something is above themselves and they're driving with their values and they're driving towards their North Star why, now they are willing to make sacrifices and to deliver something and maintain it or return it in a better state. Because there's something bigger than them. When they don't do that, then it goes back to all about me. I founded this business and I'm in charge and I'm the owner and et cetera, et cetera. Well, if that's why you went in the business and you never considered your values and never considered your why, then stewardship is going to be a difficult concept for you. So it goes back to set the foundation of values, why, and then obviously that alignment of self-reflection and humility. All comes together.
It's very good. So when we talked about, humility and that self-reflection, I think everyone knows people who are overly confident, overly stubborn, gregarious, outgoing, outspoken. And in reality, when you see them in a high stress situation or see them make a huge mistake, which every leader, if you have the gumption to actually lead, you're going to make some really big mistakes. We know at the end of the day, intrinsically, they usually lack self-esteem. They literally put out that they know what they're going on. They refuse to be humble because they know that this ego they've created is not real. And so we've got that group. And so that one everybody can identify. There's another group of people, though, that I have quizzed a lot, you have quizzed a lot, is really looking at yourself. Do you seek pleasure or avoid pain? One of my favorite questions. And so, seeking pleasure means you're willing to go through the hardship, the pain, and the things that are necessary to reach that next elevated point in your career, for the company, for the ship on the voyage. Avoid pain, you certainly need to mitigate, which you're a good risk mitigation.
Yeah, I'm a risk mitigation guy,
So that is, you can't be foolish and reckless. That's kind of obvious. But you see leaders that make it very high up into management who are great at avoiding pain, because they build great process, they build great accountability, metrics to make sure we don't drop the ball. We run great. Everything is good. Well, once you become a leader, you are many times on uncharted territory, new ventures, new areas where you're making educated guesses, guided by all the things you talked about. So that's a tough transition from I'm an avoid pain person to I'll take whatever comes at me. Again, your Viktor Frankl example, because the purpose is there. I seek that pleasure of making this business become something that can be taking these employees and the people along with me to the next level. Certainly there is some, self-preservation, some selfish reasons. Everyone wants to be successful to make money. We're not Pollyanna and silly, but truly putting others first, putting the why and purpose first, willing to take the pain to go to the next level. So what do you see as the tendencies of that split between the avoid pain, seek pleasure?
Yeah, I think the avoid pain one tends to garner a lot more support, meaning more people adopt that than seeking pleasure. And a lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to short-term versus long-term. And even in today's society, we're in this instant society, right? We have microwaves, right? Because we don't want to wait to actually for a meal to cook in an oven. And so, with instant oatmeal, right? Because you don't want to wait to get things down. And I think a lot of businesses want instantaneous success. And sometimes to seek out that short-term success, it's all about avoiding pain. It's about making all the pain go away so I can achieve success. But what they don't do is understanding that it is actually the long-term pleasure, the seeking pleasure, that is really where the satisfaction comes from. And if one has done the pieces we talked about, values along with a why, then they know that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And they've got to be willing to go through the mile after mile in order to get to across the finish line. And to do that, guess what? You're going to have to go through pain. You're going to have to hit that wall at mile 20 or mile 18 and work your way through to seek the pleasure at the far end. So I think that people will instinctively say, I want pleasure, but I think habitually they want to avoid pain because it's the thing that hurts them right now. And because we're an instantaneous, short-term thinking culture holistically, we tend to avoid pain first rather than seeking pleasure. But the seeking pleasure is the piece where the satisfaction comes in. That's where legacy comes in.
Yeah.
We've talked about some of the writings of Jim Collins, who wrote a book, Good to Great, as well as Built to Last. And he talks about 100-year-old companies. They didn't get that way to go 100 years as an organization by avoiding pain. They had to seek pleasure. They had to go through tough times, weather recessions, weather financial downturns, because the longer term goal of what they had in mind, the legacy, is what was driving them. So seeking pleasure is easier if you know your why. It goes back to Viktor Frankl, right? If we don't know the why, then we just want the pain to go away. We just want today to be good. I want to go home happy.
Yeah,
right?
I think his opinion was, I'll take however much pain is necessary.
Is necessary in order to get to my long-term pleasure, which was to see his family again or be released from the concentration camp.
Yep. He struck that out and set it out as a goal and set it out there to measure himself against. And so that again sets it out for you. I will give a little bit of pass to people because, most psychologists and psychiatrists, they throw out a number of 2.5 times the power of avoiding pain. And so that can't tell you where exactly they iron that out, but I do know from evolution and the way the body remembers things is we log what hurt us. We log what surrounded that decision, anything that triggers our brain that might bring up a pain incident, and pain in humans we can take away from a kind of section that I like to spend some time in is we're no longer out trying to find food, find a mate. Most of us are not at war all the time, although they are obviously having that in Ukraine and other places. So our brains are able to take even social pain, trigger the same chemicals as danger in the plains, caveman times, hunter-gatherer times. And so we automatically trigger towards that wasn't good. That wasn't good. That didn't feel good. And so I think without setting a objective goal, that why, that purpose outside of yourself, it is going to be extremely hard to override your genetic nature tendency along with your nurture life experiences that have, hey, I spoke up, sounds silly, in middle school, high school. I made the wrong choice and I looked like an idiot. Well, we might think that's small. Your brain coats that neurocircuitry and says, don't go there again. So anything that starts to feel like that is embedded in us. And so social media is certainly more than you and I grew up in the let's do it fast. I think now people are finding way more ways to get hurt because now they're on social media. They're listening to all likes and comments and all these things. Realize that physiologically in your brain literally creates pathways that says, don't go there, don't go there, don't go there. And so that's a tough thing to overcome without taking a lot of consideration into who you are, where you want to go. Is it aligned with the organization that you're in? Am I willing to risk that negative feeling in order to get that hit of dopamine, like you said, that is, I'm moving in a direction towards a worthy purpose. Right. And that gives me joy. That gives me fulfillment. Not a ha-ha happy, truly, I have done something today that is worthwhile.
It's interesting, the sort of the human aspects of a lot of things that we do. You just mentioned a lot about chemicals. I think that binding of those neural pathway. I think it's called myelin. I read
Myelin, yep.
Yes, it was something I think by Daniel Coyle, wrote a book called The Culture Code. Talked a lot about that. Talked about it from a talent perspective, not a pain perspective. But there's also part of the human body has been designed to go through hardship, right? When we break a bone and it heals, it actually heals stronger than it was before you broke it. And the body has this amazing way to repair itself, to go through adversity in order to keep on going. Not only that, but prepare itself for even more adversity. And so if we can get beyond the avoiding pain to seeking pleasure, I think we're going to get the benefits of both. That we're going to actually try to do things better and more appropriately and more effectively, but at the same time, still get the overall successes that we're looking for. So
something you can speak to that obviously drives us home as the ultimate sacrifice. You're in the military.
Yeah.
You know, you've had to obviously go to funerals and bury people.
Sure.
And so sacrifice is an area that, so, you know, in your mind, you say, oh, all right, I'm going to switch from avoiding pain. I'm going to seek pleasure. When in reality, you're still going to have the bad feeling, even when you start to make that step. And if you're waiting on all of a sudden for you to feel ready to go, and this is the right thing to do, instead of act first in faith towards something that you think is worthy, and then take action. If you're waiting to feel motivated, as opposed to lay out what's in alignment with what you want, take action and step out, the odds of you changing your behavior are pretty much zero.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about some of those core principles that you need to have as a good leader. Number one, we talk about humility. You've already talked about stewardship. Probably the next one is sacrifice. And if you got humility, which means you now know what it's like to be a good steward. And if you're a good steward, the sacrifice piece comes a little bit easier because you understand that it is not about you, as we've talked about many times. And, you know, from a military perspective, it's easier. And it's easier only because from the earliest days of officer candidate school or boot camp, if you're an enlisted member, you know, you're talking about something bigger than you. It's the individual group of people you're around. Maybe it's your fire team, maybe it's the squad, maybe it's the platoon, the company, the squadron, battalion, whatever word you're going to go to, but it's never just you. You're there to ensure that something else can move forward. And so the ability to sacrifice, whether that's time, whether that's energy, whether that is, hey, I'm going to spend more time, you know, at work versus being at home, provided that you can align it to that why, to that North Star, then you're able to do it. But without the other two pieces, I say if you don't have good stewardship, you don't have humility, sacrifice comes a lot harder. If you have the first two, I think sacrifice becomes something that is easier to do and is much more palatable because you know that it's going to lead you someplace greater.
Excuse me. With sacrifice, as another place you do get your dichotomy. So you get the sacrifice for others, and you get the sacrifice out of narcissism and sociopaths. And so, as an employee and as a leader, I do think one of the easiest ways I would say to check that quickly is to go back to humility. So if you're a leader and you're an employee and you go to your leader and you point out, hey, we didn't really live up to our values here, or we're out of alignment with our purpose, and they tell you, well, our values and our purpose are what I say they are.
Right.
You know, if they're more the tyranny side of business, that is a big clue that is a leader you don't need to align with. Don't make them a mentor. If you can find another job, I'd probably suggest you do that. If you also just want to make money, certainly there are plenty of successful leaders that have built big companies that are purely after money, fame, and they look like they do a lot of sacrifice, but the sacrifice is only going to be there when it's beneficial to them. It's not going to be there when they're beneficial to shareholders, to employees, to people who are below them that think that, oh, he or she's bringing me along for the ride. No, they're bringing you along as long as you can take them on the ride.
Right.
And so watch out for which sacrifice you get. Just like I mentioned earlier of, you know, give some credit on why they don't want to be humble. It may not just be speed. It may be some fear and some pain they have to overcome and take some time on that. And so there's several aspects that go into that sacrifice. Really, that one you brought up earlier is another one. So not just humility, is what is the legacy? So what do they want to leave behind? is another way to test that out. So, Scott, what do you want to leave behind, Scott?
Yeah, I definitely want to leave behind something better than what I started with. But for me, it's really, I want to take all the things that I've learned and leave those for others to learn from so that they can accelerate a path and get beyond where I was. So the legacy for me is all about sharing the wisdom. And that's kind of the legacy as I think about it. But as you were writing or speaking, I was writing some stuff down that everything we talked about, whether it's values, why, humility, stewardship, sacrifice, even now legacy, there are people who can violate all of that and get so-called success, right? They can burn all the bridges, they can burn all the relationships, and they can make a fast buck or become the next who knows. But the bottom line is, unless you are committed to legacy, then all those things are not going to be worth it. Because the legacy says that it's a longer term vision. It's a longer term purpose. And I think a lot of times people see the quickness of fame or the quickness of success, and they become enamored with that, and they don't think about, well, what about tomorrow and next month and next year and decades from now, or my family or my kin or my grandkids, whatever. They don't think about that. But if you do, then you're into a legacy building scenario. I think you and I talked about the Green family who runs Hobby Lobby, that in their mission statement or how they see things, they plan for 150 years out. We were just talking about doing a 1-year plan, right? Or 3-year plan, or even a 5-year plan. They're talking about a 150-year plan. Now that's beyond their generation or their generation's generation or their generation's generation. But they believe so much in legacy and so much about paying it forward that that's how their vision is. And so I know for a fact that they will, they will seek pleasure and not take the avoid pain route because they want to leave that legacy.
A lot of what we've spoken about is how do you recognize it in others? And so when you're self-evaluating, so we're back to self-reflecting, and so you've made it all the way this far, and you look at yourself, so you feel like you have the values right, and all the things you listed. What are some ways to think about that? I mean, you certainly have the classic, which I think is still great, is what do you want on your tombstone? What do you want to be remembered for?
Write your eulogy.
Write your eulogy is a good one. To get a little more nerdy in the psychology world, is there's a lot of those that believe that you are actually your own community. You are multiple versions of you. And what that means is you won't always be the CEO. Even if you're super successful, you don't want to become the, rich guy who has no one there to support him alone at the end of the day. And we see that a lot. And so, one of the things to look at is, are you considering where you personally will be with your family, with your friends, with what you leave behind, and who do you want to be, even past, to your point, that 5, 10, 20 years when you're getting in your later years, twilight years. So what do you want the business to be? Long-term legacy. What do you want to be while you're alive? And then what do you want to be, in the future after you've passed away? And so what would you like your family to say about you is another way to look at it. But it's easy to throw rocks, look at the other people's problems.
Yeah,
we have to turn them on ourselves.
It certainly is. And you've also got to divide the two pieces. You've got the person and then you've got the entity. We talked about that earlier, right? It's not just about you, it's about the entity as well. And, I think that a lot of people identify with work. We see this through exit planning. So those companies a person maybe has been doing a business for 30, 40 years, now they want to exit the business. And one of the most difficult things that they have is the psychological nature of dividing themselves from the business, because the business is their identity. When they're the leader of a business, I'm the CEO of X, I'm the president of X. But then once they leave the business, then what are they? That I used to be, right? X president or whatever the case. And so you've got to be able to keep both legacies going, your personal legacy and the business legacy. And if we have the overarching why that is going to continue to drive both yourself and the entity, then you're actually leaving both in a better place. The stewardship has actually worked for you as well as the entity, and both are going to be on a longer term trajectory. But I think it's that separation to understand that this isn't just about me, but at the same time, I've got to be thinking about what do I want my personal legacy to be and what I want the business legacy to be, and not necessarily think that they're absolutely connected and can't be separated, because they have to work and function independently as well.
And so that fulfillment, and that legacy, and I use fulfillment, I use joy as, technically may not be correct, but certainly more long term than happiness. So I say joy is more the climate and happiness is the weather today. I do want to be clear. We get a lot of people who get into this race and maybe line all these things up we've talked about, and they become addicted to actually reaching the goal as opposed to running the race well. So talk a little bit about, your life experience and things you've seen in leaders of, I'm pursuit of grabbing the next rung on the ladder instead of my joy is the fact that I'm moving in a noble direction, making incremental progress towards that. And if I never make it, I can check out of this world and say, you know what, I continue to march towards something that was worthy, following some noble values and trying to leave people and the company in a better place.
Yeah, I think for me, I spent decades kind of just climbing the ladder, if you want to call it that. And it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe just a little bit before I joined Rosewood, so about 5-7 years ago, that I read some more John C. Maxwell information. And what he talked about is, are you building ladders? Are you working your way up to something greater? Or are you building bridges? Are you connecting with people and leaving legacy and stewardship and all of those sort of things? And for me, the mistakes I made in the majority of my career, because now I'm more towards the end of it than the beginning of it, is I spent way too much ladder climbing. I spent way too much time trying to say, okay, this is the position I want, this is the role that I want, this is the company I want to work for. That in reality doesn't matter. Now, as I look towards the latter part of my career, the final part of my career, it's what are you leaving behind? It's not a title, right? It's how many people have I helped? How many leaders have I developed? How many organizations have I helped put on a right path? Those are the things that are much more meaningful to me than whether or not I achieved a certain dollar amount in my bank account or I received a certain title on my business card. And so, yes, I think early on in my career, the majority of it, I was ladder climbing when I should have been bridge building, because that bridge is going to connect people and continue to go on again and again. A ladder can only get you to one place.
Well, a lot of people hear that and say, that's easy to say because you're president.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think the realistic response to that is there are prerequisites to attaining your goal. I've had this discussion in colleges and a little bit in the world of everybody's an activist, not because I care about what you're an activist of, is that I said, I spoke to some students once. I said, well, if you're going to you have a passion and you want to really move the needle on that passion, but you're studying chemistry to become a doctor or a pharmacist, when are you going to have more impact? Are you going to have more impact once you've achieved that incremental success so that then you have more reach and more finance, more connection, or not? And you need to be able to reflect on the necessary items, just like we spoke about as a leader. Is this next waypoint where I need to go? Do I have the skill set? Do I have the temperament? Do I have the experience to make it to that step? And so, like all things in your dichotomy, it's never one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a mixture of both, sometimes leaning more in one direction, sometimes not. And so really, you test that, whether it's pure ambition, pure ego, pure notoriety, whatever it is, by going all the way back to the beginning of the discussion. Is this aligned with what I believe my values were? Right. Is it aligned with my personal purpose? Is the organization that I'm spending this much time and effort chasing moving me and it towards a purpose I believe in? If those are yes, then if you need to go up a ladder, you take some time to go up a ladder. But understand that ladder is still used to take you to the next ability to further your purpose out.
Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned, climbing the ladder early in my career, or for most of my career, as I mentioned, I didn't do the why piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't. I was a drone, right? I came to work and did the best I could and did what the boss told me to do. Or if I was in the Marine Corps, I followed my orders and did those sort of things. But I can honestly say now, towards the end, now having a purpose, having thought about my own personal why, aligned it with the Rosewood why, then things are much more energetic, to your point. You drive energy and purpose from it. And sometimes when you're having a bad day, you just kind of take a step back saying, is this getting me closer to the why? Am I aligned with the values and the purpose that I have set myself out for? And if the answer is yes, then you go, it's okay. I can endure the pain.
Pain is worth
right?
it.
Because I'm going to seek the longer term pleasure. But I can honestly say personally that I didn't do this early in my career. And I think that's why it's so important that we talk about it here, so that others who may be earlier in their development of their businesses can do it better than at least as I did back in the early days of mine.
I think it's a great place to close, but I think it is a good place to realize that both are necessary at different times. But if you can't measure the season you're in and keep it in alignment with what you stand for, and that's become corrupted or
Right.
co-opt someone else's and not really who you are, you're going to do like a lot of society and achieve the goal that you set out for, and then look at yourself and go, this was not, it created nothing for me. And so despite the money and the fame or the whatever it is, it won't fulfill you. And so I think that's a good spot to leave off on. You found yourself on that ship. You're the one going to be in charge. Should you be the one? Are you capable of taking it to the next level, leaving that legacy behind for the employees, for the business itself, for your family?
Right. So we know the ship and we know ourselves. Two key pieces before we can go any further on the journey. So I think we'll continue that on in our next episode of the Powerhouse Perspective. So I want to thank everyone for joining. And if you haven't listened to the first three pieces, please go back and do so. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you.